We lost more than just flavor when we stopped eating Native American recipes. We lost centuries of wisdom, survival, and soul. But what did we forget when we turned our backs on the original American kitchen? Stick around. Some of these dishes might just change how you see food. When people talk about indigenous recipes, they often miss just how much wisdom is baked into the basics. Take Three Sisters stew, for instance. It is not just a dish. It is a tradition passed down for hundreds of years, built on the sacred harmony of corn, beans, and squash. These three crops were grown together, fed each other, and in turn, fed entire communities. This stew, thick and nourishing, is what you made when you needed something that stuck to your bones and told your story in every bite. The corn added body, the beans brought protein, and the squash, that was your flavor and fiber all in one. It was earthy, sweet, and filled with the kind of balance that modern nutritionists are still trying to figure out. But more than anything, it was dependable. This was the type of meal you made in the hardest months of winter and the most thankful days of fall. It tasted like home, even if your home was a tent, a cabin, or a cliffside. Now, if that stew's got you feeling grounded, just wait until we talk about a certain smoky blue porridge that practically tastes like the desert itself. Blue corn mush was never something you could buy in a box. You made it. You learned it. You passed it on. And if you were part of a Pueblo community in New Mexico, you probably grew up thinking it was the only breakfast that ever mattered. The cornmeal used here is not just any corn. It is stone-ground blue corn, mixed with juniper ash to unlock nutrients and add a mineral kick most people would not even recognize. It is smoky, it is nutty, and it is shockingly filling. This was a dish that kept generations of farmers, shepherds, and builders going from sunrise to moonlight. You did not have time for Eggs Benedict or sugar-coated cereals when your entire day was labor. You needed something honest and hot, and this mush brought that in spades. And if you ever had it cold the next morning, even better. The desert air made it denser, firmer, almost like a cake. So yeah, blue corn mush was not just food. It was fuel. And if the breakfast table was sacred, then this dish was its offering. But if you think that is the peak of morning comfort, wait till you unwrap what comes next. Literally. Tuya, also known as Cherokee bean bread, is one of those foods that makes you feel like you are part of something older. You would start with cornmeal and mashed beans, nothing fancy, and wrap that mix tightly in corn husks or sometimes leaves, then steam it until it is soft and dense like a tamale's cousin. The best part? It only used what was already in the pantry. There was no need for sugar, yeast, or anything imported. This was made by hand, often with a fire pit outside and the whole family pitching in. It was the kind of thing you brought to a community meal where everyone knew whose bean bread was whose. It was modest, but when done right, it had this deep, earthy flavor that did not need any butter or spread to feel complete. You would eat it hot, straight from the husk, steam still clinging to your fingers. There was no such thing as leftovers. And just like that, a humble bundle of corn and beans told the story of generations. But if you thought this was a warm hug of a dish, the next recipe is like a full-on wool blanket in the middle of winter. There is something about mutton stew that makes time slow down. Maybe it is the way it simmers for hours, or the way the hominy swells up in the broth like it is soaking in every bit of flavor from the lamb, the onions, and the dried chilies. The Navajo people have been making this dish for longer than most cities have had streetlights, and they make it count. Mutton, if you have not had it, is deeper than your regular lamb. It is gamey in the best way, bold and rich. And when paired with the chewy texture of hominy, corn that has been nixtamalized for both nutrition and texture, you get something that feels substantial. You do not just eat this stew. You sit with it. You respect it. It feeds not just the body, but the memory of sheep herding on sunburnt mesas and cooking under stars brighter than anything electric. It is no frills, just flavor. You tear up some flatbread, scoop it up, and hope it never runs out. But if this was the heart of the desert, then what comes next is pure forest and lake, wild rice and maple, sweetened by the north winds. Some dishes sing like a lullaby, and Ojibwe wild rice and maple chicken is one of them. You can practically hear the wind in the pine trees when it hits your tongue. This dish comes from the Great Lakes region, and it feels like a love letter to the woods. Wild rice, which is not even technically rice but an aquatic grass, was hand-harvested from canoes with care and tradition. It pops in your mouth when cooked right, nutty and earthy with a kind of chew you do not forget. Now, pair that with chicken that has been glazed in maple syrup, real maple syrup, not the kind that comes in plastic jugs, and roasted until the skin is crisp and the flavor caramelizes into something magical. The result is a plate that feels rustic and elegant at the same time. It is not just dinner, it is an experience, a forest hike, a family feast, a fireside story. This one is sweet, savory, and deeply spiritual. And while that might have your cravings leaning sweet, what comes next is going to hit your taste buds like a thunderclap: bison chili with the bold bite of wild fruit. Buffalo chili with choke cherry sauce is one of those meals that grabs you by the collar and says, "Sit down, you are not going anywhere." It is rich, hearty, and absolutely unforgettable. You start with bison, leaner than beef, with a deeper flavor that comes from roaming open plains, not feedlots. Add beans, roasted peppers, maybe even a hint of smoked paprika if you want to cheat just a little. But the real magic? That comes from the choke cherry sauce. These wild little berries pack a punch, tart, slightly bitter, and perfectly balanced when you add a touch of honey or maple syrup. They were a staple for many Plains tribes and used in everything from pemmican to puddings. In this chili, they swirl into the broth like a sweet tart lightning bolt, cutting through the meatiness and elevating the entire dish. It is bold, it is ancestral, and it is delicious. This was the kind of meal shared at powwows and celebrations, hearty enough for warriors and warm enough for winter nights. But if this is a celebration of fire and depth, then next we are digging into something quiet and ancient. Bread made from oak trees, believe it or not. Acorn bread is something that should not work, but absolutely does. Picture the oak tree you walk past on your way to work. Now imagine turning those fallen acorns into a nutty, rich loaf of bread that has been baked the same way for thousands of years. California tribes, especially the Miwok and Pomo, knew exactly how to make this magic happen. First, you gather and shell the acorns, then leach them with water, sometimes in baskets left by stream beds for days, to remove the bitter tannins. What you are left with is a soft, fragrant flour that is packed with protein and flavor. You mix it with water, sometimes a touch of honey or berries if you had them, then bake it in clay ovens or under hot coals. The result is earthy, dense, and just sweet enough to make you close your eyes for a second. It is a humble bread with a proud history, one that connects directly to the land it came from. You would not find this on a grocery shelf. You had to earn it. And if you thought this was rustic cooking at its finest, the next dish is pure theater. Salmon cooked with fire, smoke, and a little bit of magic. Salmon on cedar planks is not just a cooking method, it is a performance. This is how the tribes of the Pacific Northwest honored both the fish and the fire. You take a fresh-caught salmon, split and cleaned, and pin it to a cedar board with wooden skewers. Then you lean the board close to an open flame, close enough for the smoke to kiss it, but not so close that it burns. What happens next is slow alchemy. The oils from the cedar seep into the salmon, blending with the fish's natural richness and creating a flavor so bold and so smoky, it does not need seasoning at all. This dish was cooked outdoors, beside rivers, surrounded by canoes and laughter. People would gather around the fire not just for food, but for stories, for connection. When you take your first bite, you taste the water, the wood, and the flame all in one. It is elegance dressed up as campfire food. But if that was smoke and sizzle, next we are moving to something softer, something that tastes like a grandmother's whisper. Let me introduce you to a berry sauce so good it makes jam feel like an afterthought. Wojapi is not just a sauce, it is a revelation. Made from choke cherries, June berries, or even wild blueberries if you had them, this thick, sweet tart dish is a staple among the Lakota and Dakota Sioux. but it is not spread thin like jam. This is served warm and ladled generously over fry bread, roasted meats, or even eaten by the spoonful. Traditionally, it was made by slowly simmering down berries with water until they broke down and thickened naturally, sweetened with just a touch of honey or maple syrup. No gelatin, no preservatives, just patience. The result? A deep, velvety berry flavor that clings to the tongue and lingers in the memory. Wojapi is the kind of thing you make in a big pot on the stove while kids are running around and elders are telling stories from the old days. It is not fancy. It is not fast. But it is unforgettable. And when you pair it with the right dish, like say a smoky slice of roasted turkey or a freshly cooked corn cake, it becomes downright transcendent. Speaking of pairing, you will want to stick around for the next one. It is a Southern comfort classic, but with a tribal twist that brings new life to breakfast. Hominy grits are already a comfort food in the South, but Creek hominy grits with smoked turkey? That is a whole new level. Forget your standard diner version. This one is creamy, smoky, and full of intention. The Creek people made their grits from dried corn soaked in an alkaline solution, a process called nixtamalization, which broke down the hull and unlocked all the good nutrients hiding inside. What you end up with is something way heartier than instant grits. It has got texture. It has got history. Now, fold in chunks of smoked turkey, leftovers from a roast or cured just enough to hold that fire-kissed flavor, and the whole thing comes alive. The turkey brings salt and depth, the grits bring body and warmth. This was food made for early mornings and long days ahead. And if you thought that was an artful bowl of porridge, wait until you see what the Hopi people have been doing with cornmeal for centuries. Something so thin and delicate, it is basically a miracle on a hot stone. Hopi piki bread might be the most delicate piece of cooking you will ever witness. This is not your average flatbread. It is whisper thin, paper light, and made from blue cornmeal mixed with water and a touch of ash. But here is the catch. There is no pan, no oven, and no room for error. The batter is hand-smoothed in a single stroke across a burning hot stone, and within seconds, it sets. You peel it off like parchment. It is soft but strong, flexible like rice paper, and every sheet is layered with care. For the Hopi people, making piki is a rite of passage, a skill taught slowly over years and passed from mother to daughter, generation to generation. It is food you handle with reverence, not just because of how hard it is to make, but because of how much history it holds. Eating it is like tasting memory itself. And if you think this is as light and poetic as food can get, just wait. Because next up is a casserole that is just as seasonal, but grounded in sunshine and soil. When it comes to summer eating, nothing hits the spot quite like Zuni summer squash casserole. This dish is warm weather on a plate. It starts with sliced squash, yellow, green, whatever you had from the garden, and layers it with sun-dried corn that has been rehydrated and roasted just enough to bring out its natural sweetness. The flavor is light, sweet, and kissed with a bit of smoke. This is not a cheesy, heavy casserole. This one breathes. The Zuni people have always known how to make the most of seasonal harvests, and this dish is no exception. You might throw in a handful of onions or a few herbs from the windowsill planter, but the real star is the simplicity. It is bright, it is honest, and it is proof that you do not need cream of anything soup to make a casserole worth remembering. But if you thought this dish was pure comfort, the next one is pure nostalgia, an old-school sweet made of trees and thyme. Long before candy bars were ever wrapped in shiny plastic, there was maple candy, one of the original sweet treats of the Woodland tribes. This is the good stuff. We are talking boiled maple syrup poured into carved wooden molds or drizzled over fresh snow, left to cool until it hardened into amber perfection. The texture is somewhere between fudge and toffee, soft at first bite, but rich with flavor that lingers. No corn syrup, no additives, just sap and skill. Tribes like the Abenaki, Ojibwe, and Haudenosaunee knew exactly when to tap the trees. Early spring, when the nights were cold and the days started warming up. You would collect the sap, then spend all day tending a fire, stirring, watching, and waiting. It was for special occasions, ceremonies, and storytelling nights. One bite and you were hooked. Now, if that has your sweet tooth wide awake, do not go anywhere. The next dish takes that sweetness and wraps it in the warm, golden glow of autumn, inside a pumpkin no less. Imagine carving open a pumpkin, not for Halloween, but for dinner. Menominee wild rice-stuffed pumpkin is exactly that. Autumn wrapped in a gourd. You start with a small pumpkin, scoop out the seeds, and roast it just enough to soften the flesh. Then comes the filling: cooked wild rice, sautéed onions, maybe some cranberries or diced mushrooms, and just enough seasoning to bring it all together. When it bakes, the rice soaks in the pumpkin's sweetness, and the outer shell becomes this caramelized, edible bowl. It is cozy, it is satisfying, and it is a dish that tells a seasonal story. Wild rice was sacred to the Menominee people and other Great Lakes tribes, often harvested by canoe in shallow waters where it grew like grass. It was a food of celebration, community, and nourishment. And if you thought that was resourceful, the next recipe is going to take survival food to a whole new level. Get ready for the original Indigenous energy bar made for warriors and wanderers. Wasna is what you packed when you had a long journey ahead and no room for excuses. This was the original energy bar, made by the Plains tribes with dried bison meat, rendered fat, and berries, usually chokecherries or June berries, pounded together into a dense, chewy blend that could last for weeks without spoiling. You could take it hunting, traveling, or straight into battle. It was high in protein, fat, and natural sugars, everything you needed to survive, wrapped up in one bite. Some tribes added nuts, others flavored it with wild mint or crushed seeds. The Lakota called it wasna, but variations existed from Montana to Oklahoma. It was food for people on the move. This was survival food with soul, and if you thought fermentation was only for yogurt and hipsters, just wait until you hear about the next dish: a tangy corn porridge with roots deep in Florida swamps. Smoky is the kind of dish that sneaks up on you. At first glance, it looks simple, just corn porridge. But one spoonful and you realize you are tasting something ancient, complex, and strangely addictive. The Seminole people in Florida made smoky by boiling cracked corn until it softened, then letting it ferment slightly over time. That light tang, that is where the magic is. It gives the porridge a kick, almost like sourdough, but smoother. Traditionally, it was served warm and plain, but sometimes seasoned with salt, and in later years, sweetened just slightly with cane syrup or berries. It filled bellies during lean seasons and nourished the spirit on rainy days. It may not be flashy, but it is unforgettable once you have had it. And if you thought tangy porridge was the far end of the Indigenous breakfast table, let me introduce you to a pancake that smells like the desert and tastes like toasted honey. Apache mesquite flour pancakes are like the Southwest in breakfast form. Mesquite flour is not made from wheat or grain. It is ground from the seed pods of the mesquite tree, which grows wild across desert landscapes like it owns the place. And the flavor? It is sweet, almost like cinnamon and molasses had a baby, with a deep, nutty undertone. The Apache people used it in everything from flatbreads to cakes, but pancakes? That is where it truly shines. You mix it with a bit of water, maybe an egg if you have one, and cook it slow on a griddle until it bubbles and browns. These were the kinds of meals you made when the land was dry and the stores were far. You worked with what nature gave you, and mesquite flour gave a lot. But if this was sweet, cozy comfort, the next dish is anything but, because we are diving into something smoky, savory, and shot through with wild game. Succotash is one of those dishes that seems simple, just corn and beans, right? But the Iroquois version turns that simplicity into a masterclass of flavor. You start with the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, sautéed together until they caramelize slightly. Then, here comes the twist, you add slices of smoked duck. That rich, smoky meat lifts the whole dish into something downright luxurious. The Iroquois knew that corn and beans were great on their own, but when paired with duck that had been smoked over hickory or applewood, you get a flavor that wraps around your tongue and lingers long after the bite is gone. You would bring this to big gatherings, feasts, or just make it to show someone you cared. This was not your side dish succotash. This was the main event. And if you thought duck was the boldest thing you could put in a stew, let me take you north, way north, to a soup made from fish heads and seaweed that will make you rethink everything. Fish head soup might not be what you crave on a chilly night, but to the Tlingit people of Alaska, it was sacred. This dish is about respect. Respect for the ocean, for the fish, and for every part of what you catch. You do not throw the head away. You simmer it, slow and steady, until the broth is rich with fat and flavor. Add seaweed harvested fresh from coastal rocks, some wild onions or kelp, and you have got a bowl of something bold, briny, and absolutely primal. The eyes, the cheeks, the bones, all of it was honored and eaten. It was believed that wasting any part of the fish disrespected the spirit of the animal. But beyond the symbolism, there is real flavor here. You sat around the pot and remembered your place in the cycle of life. Now, if that has you wide-eyed, just wait. We are heading south next, for a dish so rare and real it might stop you in your tracks. Roasted possum with sweet potatoes is the kind of dish people whisper about, half in disbelief and half in awe. But for the Mississippi Choctaw, this was a real and honest meal, one that used what the forest offered, no shame, no waste. Possum may not sound appetizing to modern ears, but back then, it was game meat like any other. When prepared right, cleaned, marinated, slow roasted until the fat rendered and the skin crisped, it tasted like a cross between pork and dark chicken. The trick was pairing it with sweet potatoes, which grew wild and were easy to store through the winter. Roasted together, they made a dish that was surprisingly balanced, sweet, savory, hearty. And if you thought that was the strangest thing to come out of the Southwest, just hold on. We are about to top sweet potatoes with something bright pink and a little wild. Get ready for prickly pear syrup poured over fresh corn cakes. Prickly pear syrup is what happens when the desert decides to show off. This bright pink liquid looks like it belongs in a candy shop, but it comes straight from the cactus fruit of the American Southwest. Once you get past the spines, literally, it is a treasure. The syrup is made by scooping out the ripe fruit, boiling it down, straining it, and adding just enough sweetener to balance out the natural tang. Corn cakes, soft and hearty from stone-ground maize, soak up the syrup like a sponge. Every bite is bright, sweet, and satisfying without being heavy. This dish was often served during harvest celebrations, when the cactus fruit was at its best. The colors alone are enough to make your day better, and the taste seals the deal. If you have never tried cactus for breakfast, you are missing out. But if you think syrup from a cactus is wild, just wait until you taste a porridge made from the seeds of pine trees. Yeah, really, and it is one of the coziest meals around. Pine nut porridge is the kind of breakfast that sticks with you, literally and figuratively. The Great Basin tribes of Nevada and Utah knew how to work with what the land gave them, and pine nuts were gold. They would gather them in the fall, roast them, crack them open, and grind them into a rich, nutty flour. Mix that with water, heat it gently, and you have got pine nut porridge, warm, smooth, and earthy. It is not too sweet, but if you toss in a handful of wild berries, currants, gooseberries, or even juniper if you are feeling bold, it brightens up beautifully. The texture is somewhere between oatmeal and cream of wheat, but with a buttery finish that oats could never dream of. And if that was breakfast comfort at its finest, the next dish is pure elemental brilliance, a fish baked not in foil, but in skunk cabbage, the original slow cooker from the riverbanks. When you hear skunk cabbage, you probably do not think dinner. But for the Pawnee people, it was a culinary tool, and a brilliant one at that. They used the giant leaves of skunk cabbage to wrap fresh-caught fish, sealing in moisture and flavor as it baked over coals. This method is ancient and genius. The fish, usually river-caught trout or perch, was stuffed with herbs, maybe a few wild onions or crushed berries, then tucked into the cabbage leaves and buried in the hot earth, covered with stones or ashes. Slow roasting this way made the fish unbelievably tender, infused with the green vegetal aroma of the leaves. And even though the name might turn heads, the taste always won people over. But if you are craving something more coastal, the next dish is about to wash in with the tide, an indigenous chowder that predates New England and brings the forest right into your bowl. Before the clam chowder we know today was ever poured into a bread bowl, there was Wampanoag quahog chowder. This was the original, thick, hearty, and completely tied to land and sea. The Wampanoag people harvested quahogs, those big, sturdy, hard-shell clams, from coastal waters, chopped them up, and simmered them into a stew with corn, wild herbs, and sometimes squash or beans. There was no heavy cream. Instead, the broth came alive with the natural saltiness of the sea, mellowed by starchy corn and sharpened by native herbs like sweetgrass or sage, the kind of dish that brought people together and left no bowl unfinished. It is still made today, and when done right, it is every bit as comforting as the modern version, just without the butter overload. And if you think chowder is where ancient cooking ends, get ready. The next one is even older, sweet, slow-cooked, and pulled right from the root of a wildflower that helped feed entire civilizations. Camas root mash is one of those foods you can almost hear when you taste it, slow, warm, and humming with history. The Nez Perce people, along with many plateau tribes, harvested camas bulbs every spring from open meadows. They looked a bit like onions, but tasted like something else entirely, sweet, nutty, and rich when cooked low and slow. And slow was the key. Camas root had to be baked in an underground pit for up to 2 days, a technique that transformed its starches into sugars. Once soft, it was mashed into a thick, fragrant paste, often eaten plain or shaped into patties and dried for travel, filling enough to be a meal. It was one of the great gifts of the land, and it still holds a powerful place in traditional diets and ceremonies. If mashed potatoes ever got a spiritual upgrade, this would be it. And speaking of rustic upgrades, the next dish is a skillet classic straight from the woodlands: corn, jerky, and a whole lot of heart. Let us talk deer hash caddo style. Sometimes a skillet and a fire are all you need to make something unforgettable. The caddo corn and deer jerky skillet hash was just that, a humble meal with a whole lot of power behind it. Found in the forests of Arkansas and Louisiana, this dish made the most of preserved venison. Deer jerky was tough, sure, but once you chopped it up and cooked it low and slow with corn, onions, and a bit of wild garlic or herbs, it softened into something rich and savory. The corn was often roasted first, adding a smoky edge that turned simple ingredients into something heartwarming. This dish filled stomachs and told stories at the same time. And if you thought skillet cooking was rustic, wait until we head even further into the plains, where buffalo bones, not just the meat, took center stage in a soup that was more medicine than meal. Buffalo bone soup might sound like a desperate last resort, but for the Mandan people it was a carefully crafted, nutrient-rich tradition. When you are working with limited resources, nothing goes to waste, not even the bones. After the prime cuts of meat were used up, the bones were roasted and simmered for hours, sometimes days, until they released every last bit of marrow and collagen into the pot. This was slow food before slow food had a name. It warmed the body, healed the joints, and kept you full well into the next day. And because bones were available long after the meat was gone, this was also a survival dish, passed around fires when times were lean but spirits stayed high. But if you thought broth was where the plains stopped showing off, think again. Up next is a snack that crunches like a granola bar and has roots deeper than any supermarket shelf. Sunflower seed cakes were the original energy bar. The Hidatsa people knew how to get serious nutrition into a small, portable bite, and this was their answer. Take roasted sunflower seeds, native to the plains and cultivated with care, grind them down, and mix them with dried berries, maybe a little honey or mashed root if you had it. Shape them into small cakes and dry them in the sun or by the fire. They turned crisp, chewy, and sweet all at once. These little cakes were carried on journeys, eaten during planting seasons, or handed out to kids as snacks that did not come in foil wrappers. And it was a tradition that traveled well. Speaking of traveling, the next stop on our indigenous culinary journey takes us to the Northern California coast, where one slippery, smoky fish changed everything about dinner. Smoked eel is not for the faint of heart, but for the Yurok people of Northern California, it was a delicacy worth the catch. These slippery river eels were abundant and full of fat, which made them ideal for smoking. After cleaning and seasoning them, often with salt, seaweed, and pine smoke, they were hung above smoldering alderwood fires and left to cure. The result? A deeply flavored silky meat with a smoky tang that went straight to your bones. Pair that with wild greens, things like fiddleheads, miner's lettuce, or sea rocket, and you had a plate that was rich, bold, and nourishing. The greens were often sautéed lightly or served raw with vinegar and herbs, their sharpness cutting through the richness of the eel. But if you thought smoked eel was as coastal as it gets, wait until you dip into the Arctic waters, where seals, snow, and seaside greens come together in a dish colder than ice but rich enough to warm you from the inside out. Alutiiq beach greens and seal fat dip is one of those dishes that challenges everything you think you know about food. Cold, coastal, and full of fat, but in a good way. The Alutiiq people of southern Alaska made this from what they had access to in their unforgiving environment. Seal fat was rendered down until creamy and smooth, almost like butter, then mixed with chopped greens harvested from the shore. Things like goose tongue, sea lettuce, and beach lovage. The salt from the sea, the bite of the greens, and the richness of the fat created a balance that is hard to explain and impossible to forget. It was spread over dried fish, used as a dip for root vegetables, or even eaten on its own in small bites. This was survival food that tasted like celebration. And if that cold breeze off the Arctic put a chill in your bones, do not worry. We are heading inland next, to the warmth of fry bread and berries so thick they will leave a stain on your heart. Venison is one of the most common meats throughout all of history, so it's no surprise that the Native Americans have their own nutty take on it as well. In forests and grasslands, deer would usually thrive a lot more than what we're used to. There used to be, massive packs of them roaming around everywhere. Before the 20th century, also, the American chestnut tree was in its golden years. It was devastated later by regional hazards and blight. Chestnuts were something that were available all over eastern woodlands, so it was very easy to forage them and gather them for emergency situations. Venison was always a staple meat for all kinds of tribes, especially the Cherokee, Shawnee, and Algonquians. Deer was something that was respected by tribes for how much the animal would take care of them. It would give them hides for clothing, the sinew was used for tools, and the bones were used in medicinal broths and kept for trading or for hunting tools. The meat was also very flavorful and important for making pemmican, which was a superfood essential to the Native Americans. Venison was usually cut into cubes and put into a broth with roasted and peeled chestnuts. Corn husk-wrapped tamales have incredibly deep roots in a lot of Mesoamerican cultures. I know you might not really associate them with a lot of different ethnic groups, but it's genuinely something a lot of them have used throughout their history. There were specific tribes like the Pueblo and Hopi that had very agricultural lifestyles, and the Pueblo even had trade and cultural connections with Mesoamerican civilizations. They would share their knowledge with Mexican cultures, and in return, the Mexicans would share theirs. And that's how Native American tribes first became familiar with the idea of tamales. They were already very used to working with dried corn kernels and grounding them into masa. Also, these are a lot different from the typical tamales you might be used to because they usually rely on bison, venison, and rabbit. And each of those has its unique world of flavor different from the chicken and beef we're so used to on the corners of our streets. If you're looking for a fresh spin, try to hit up an authentic Native American joint or work with some venison or rabbit at home. You might be pretty surprised. Hogging an entire hog for yourself was a great hobby for Native Americans. Now, mind you, pine nut soup was something that wouldn't last a day in modern times, but was all the rage back then even outside of the indigenous communities. Pine nuts were considered such a staple food for so many different indigenous tribes, particularly throughout the Southwest and the Great Basin regions. They were tribes like the Apache, Hopi, and Navajo, to name a few. They all relied on pune nuts for two things: their exceptionally buttery and rich taste and their incredible amount of fat content. Pine nuts were traditionally just gathered from the branches of piñón pine trees, and they were always roasted for easy amounts of shelling. Then, they would be ground into a nutrient-dense paste, and one of the most common ways to do that was to consume them in this rich soup that could be eaten alone or mixed with other kinds of dried meats and cornmeal or wild greens. Pine nuts are something that would basically be made in a broth that would be based either around the local game of the day or the vegetables that were available. Then, optional thickeners such as cornmeal and ground mesquite beans were something that were dearly beloved. Wild herbs were something that were considered optional, but most people honestly always added them, at least across the recipes I can find. It was sustainable, long-lasting, and the pine nuts could also last a tribe months if they were kept properly. They were a rich source of protein, magnesium, and vitamin E as well. Gooseberry and elk were one of the most prized dishes that Native Americans would make regularly. This was because elk was one of the most treasured animals they had. In the Rocky Mountains, the Pacific Northwest, and the Great Plains, all sorts of tribes were known for how much they prioritized elk usage. This is because elk was something that was beneficial overall, just like deers and bison. The hides wouldn't just be used for clothing. A good quality elk hide, or one that was prized in towns like a white hide, would actually go for a fair amount of resources. They were also something that would provide meat for literally months. Even one elk was a game changer for a tribe going through tough times. They were dried for later use all the time, and the most valuable cuts were always kept for slow roasting so that they could have a great meal out of it. It was preserved for special ceremonies and hunting feasts, which would usually occur during the summer when gooseberries were also in harvest. A roasted elk haunch with some gooseberry sauce was enough food for an entire family or an entire hunting party. So, imagine what it could do for us today. Buffalo and hominy soup is a bit of a unique one. I know that hominy is still something a lot of people prefer, definitely some UNCs and boomers, but also some people who just like retro, vintage, or cultural food. Buffalo meat is a bit harder to get than wild rice though, and depending on where you live, this might not be a dish you're able to recreate, but I digress. You brown the buffalo meat in a pretty large pot, simmer the broth, add the hominy and seasonings, and just stir. Then you taste, test, and serve. It's a pretty easy recipe considering that the rest of the stuff on here does take some technical cooking skill, especially when it comes to the prep work. If you do decide to recreate this, you should honestly aim for making a winter dish out of it. That's how it was historically eaten back in the day for the Native American peoples as well, and that's because bison meat was really good at keeping you warm. Plus, this is just one of those soups that brings life back into you. Salmon candy was an incredibly unique kind of candy, and I mean that. We barely have anything that's like it in today's modern world, despite our time being dominated by processed sugars and candies. Also known as Indian candy, this was a salmon-oriented dish that would be smoked and sweetened, and the idea to mix both of those techniques together was something that the Tlingit, Haida, and Coast Salish tribes popularized. They were predominantly placed in the Pacific Northwest, and these tribes had relied on salmon for thousands of years. They had their own preservation methods as well, and smoking was one of them. It was meant to help prevent fish from going bad during long and frigid winters. So how do we go from preservation to salmon candy? It's actually a modern adaptable of the traditional smoked salmon dish, just with different kinds of sweeteners that have been incorporated. You have maple syrup, honey, and even brown sugar. At the end, you get a caramelized glaze that gives you the sugar rush you're looking for on top of a decadent, smoky, and slightly chewy salmon. Most tribes would use the salmon that were caught in the Columbia and Yukon rivers, such as Chinook, Sockeye, or Coho. Others would prioritize the kind of smoking wood used, as some believed that there were differences between alder, cedar, and fruitwoods in terms of the smoky flavor they would produce. If you really want to do something for a big flat-out feast, though, there's just nothing better than some Native American-style spit-roasted turkey. Turkey was a major source of protein and food for indigenous peoples in the eastern woodlands. They had been used to preparing and handling turkey for generations. They even had the cleaning process down to a science. Also, The feathers of the bird were used for clothing, for arrows so that they would fly faster, and for rituals. I think they had some pretty good Thanksgiving ideas a long while before it even became a thing. If you wanted to recreate this today, you should ideally use a wild turkey, but even a domestic one works well. Also, smoked paprika and wild onions, plus the sage and thyme. I also suggest keeping it authentic and going with some bear fat or walnut oil if you can. You would need to set up a rotisserie spit over an open fire if you can. The end result is this deeply flavorful turkey that's got this wonderfully crispy exterior on the outside, but a smoky taste and tender feel on the inside. It's really just a delight for any kind of big gathering or party, and it's not a dish you want to be missing out on. Chili-spiced pumpkin mash is a dish that does wonders with some flavors you would have never imagined working together. The sweetness of pumpkin is something we normally would never associate with the intense tang of chili spices, but hey, this savory and sweet mash is here to break stereotypes and expand horizons. Pumpkin was a major crop for indigenous peoples across all kinds of regions in America, both the northern and southern parts. It was something people loved for the immense amount of nutrition it had. Indigenous peoples of the Northeast and Great Lakes regions would grow several different versions of squash, and some of these would include pumpkins. It was definitely a very fall-only item, and to be honest, it went along with the autumn vibes very well. People loved the contrast of this dish. The natural sweetness of the pumpkin balanced out very well from the heat of the chili peppers, and it made a very comforting dish. The texture of the mashed pumpkin was something that contrasted with the smoky notes of the chili, and that led to it becoming a very well-rounded flavor profile. It was like a party in your mouth. This is a recipe that's perfect for all the different kinds of vegetarian fans out there. Manuman pilaf is something that's actually a traditional Native American dish centered entirely around wild rice. I know a lot of us are some genuine fans of rice, so for you guys, this will be a good one. It's something that's great as a summer or early fall dish, and it's also pretty healthy. The nutty and earthy flavor unique to wild rice is what really makes this dish stand out. It gives you a way stronger flavor than brown or white rice. It's also a lot more firm and chewy, which is great for people who don't really like their rice on the mushy side. If you parch it with fire, you can even impart a smoky undertone to it. All you need are some walnuts, maple syrup, and cranberries, and you're good to go. Wild rice is still something you can easily get from any local grocery store. Once you have everything you need, you rinse the wild rice, simmer it until it's tender, drain all the excess water, add any flavorings, and then serve it as warm as you can. This is a dish that's considered sacred in the culture of some tribes, particularly the Anishinaabe culture. It's also a great source of protein if you aren't feeling like meat this week. Blue corn mush was something that was a staple dish among the Navajo and other various tribes throughout the southwestern lands. The Hopi and Pueblo people were most commonly known for having this. It was actually made from blue cornmeal, mixed with water, then blended with juniper or cedar ash and cooked into a porridge. Blue cornmeal is something that has incredible prestige in Native American culture because it's made from the equally as important crop, blue corn. It's a unique kind of corn because it has a much more concentrated sweetness and nuttiness to it than others too. There's the occasional salt and sweetener as well, but that's really just it. Blue corn mush was considered an essential dish for survival in humid and arid climates. It gave sustenance because it was really easy to prepare, carry, and consume quickly. It also was considered a nutritional powerhouse due to its incredible amount of fiber, protein, and antioxidants. Blue corn mush was something that was considered a ceremonial food, and it was also something a lot of tribes relied on for it being baby food. It had a really mild flavor, and it had an incredible amount of digestibility benefits. Plus, the fiber that it had meant that most people would stay full for a lot longer. Acorn squash was an incredibly popular cultivated vegetable among many different kinds of tribes. Squash in itself is something the Native Americans experimented with a fair amount. All of that effort eventually brought about the Three Sisters agricultural method, which was basically just growing crops of corn, beans, and squash together. The way they grew helped the other plants grow, so they were always grown together because the end result was more fantastic than if they were grown individually. Sweetening squash with maple syrup was also something that was popular among tribes who were centered around maple syrups, and I don't know if you know this, but tapping into maple trees for the syrup was a very common practice of the Native American peoples. They were arguably better at it than anyone else too, especially because of how much they valued maple syrup as a natural sweetener. Some tribes genuinely loved to have it without the syrup, though. They would slice it and dry the squash in the sun for long-term storage. Buffalo roast with juniper berries is another flavorful Great Plains dish that makes use of every single part of the entire buffalo. The meat was used for food, the hides were skinned, preserved, and used for shelter and different clothing. Utensils and different kidneys of daily tools were made out of the bones, and even the dung was preserved so it could be used later for fuel. That's efficiency, like the textbook definition of it. Slow roasting buffalo meat was something most people associated with Native American culture anyway, but the native seasonings were the real highlight of the show. Juniper berries in particular were an extremely key method of preparing different kinds of nourishing meals. Juniper berries were used by so many different kinds of tribes across Northern America and had such a resinous, citrusy flavor to them that they were almost the go-to choice for most dishes. They also worked as a natural preservative, so it felt like they were made to work with savory meat dishes. One of the other reasons why I say that is because of the kind of meats Native American people worked with. Most of them, like buffalo and bison, were deeply rich in their flavor, and juniper berries helped to cut through that and balance out the flavors. The buffalo would be rubbed with those crushed berries, then slowly cooked over an open fire or a pit oven, and it would actually be a beautiful process to observe. Clay-baked fish is also something that's a bit unconventional because it doesn't really match up with anything we use today. It's a traditional cooking method that was used by several Native American tribes spread across the northern regions. A lot of places in North America were rich sources of fish, like the Great Lakes and the Pacific Northwest. Back then, preserving moisture was its own separate issue and struggle, and this was a particularly widespread way of doing that. This method would help the fish retain most of its moisture while also sealing in all kinds of natural flavors, and the end result was a much more exciting dish. Now, this works with most kinds of fish, so it's not like there's some strict preference. You should just roll with what you like. If you want to be historically accurate, then the Chinook and Haida tribes were pretty fond of using salmon. Some tribes also used trout or catfish, but the idea was to prepare the entire fish while also leaving the scales intact. Why would they do this? It was all to help the fish be baked properly. You didn't want anything messing up the meat on the inside. Now, some tribes were also fond of stuffing their fish, but if that's a little much, you don't have to go the extra mile. Gooseberry and elk were one of the most prized dishes that Native Americans would make regularly. This was because elk was one of the most treasured animals they had. In the Rocky Mountains, the Pacific Northwest, and the Great Plains, all sorts of tribes were known for how much they prioritized elk usage. This is because elk was something that was beneficial overall, just like deers and bison. The hides wouldn't just be used for clothing. A good quality elk hide, or one that was prized in towns like a white hide, would actually go for a fair amount of resources. They were also something that would provide meat for literally months. Even one elk was a game changer for a tribe going through tough times. They were dried for later use all the time, and the most valuable cuts were always kept for slow roasting so that they could have a great meal out of it. It was preserved for special ceremonies and hunting feasts, which would usually occur during the summer when gooseberries were also in harvest. A roasted elk haunch with some gooseberry sauce was enough food for an entire family or an entire hunting party. So, imagine what it could do for us today. So, sotol roasted roots is a really famous indigenous culinary tradition that merges two ideal ones. Sotol is something that is deeply rooted in the survival foodways of the Southwest, and it is a hardy desert plant that people typically find growing in the Southwest and northern parts of the United States and Mexico. It was used by indigenous tribes such as the Tarahumara and Coahuiltecan tribes, and they had several different kinds of uses for it. As far as desert plants went, it was insanely versatile. You could use it for food, fiber, fermentation, and a lot more. Sotol was something that is best known in today's world as a distilled base for alcoholic drinks, but its underground root crown is what made indigenous people give it the time of day. See, it was incredibly filled with carbohydrates, more than any other desert plant in the surrounding would have any right to be. Sotol's hearts and roots would be roasted in earthen pit ovens so that the fiber structure could break down, turning them into these starchy and sweet sources of food. They had a lot of natural sugar inside them that would get released when they were boiled. Manuman pilaf is something that's actually a traditional Native American dish centered entirely around wild rice. I know a lot of us are some genuine fans of rice, so for you guys, this will be a good one. It's something that's great as a summer or early fall dish, and it's also pretty healthy. The nutty and earthy flavor unique to wild rice is what really makes this dish stand out. It gives you a way stronger flavor than brown or white rice. It's also a lot more firm and chewy, which is great for people who don't really like their rice on the mushy side. If you parch it with fire, you can even impart a smoky undertone to it. All you need are some walnuts, maple syrup, and cranberries, and you're good to go. Wild rice is still something you can easily get from any local grocery store. Once you have everything you need, you rinse the wild rice, simmer it until it's tender, drain all the excess water, add any flavorings, and then serve it as warm as you can. This is a dish that's considered sacred in the culture of some tribes, particularly the Anishinaabe culture. It's also a great source of protein if you aren't feeling like meat this week. Wild rice and cranberry pilaf is something that's really inseparable from the Great Lakes and Upper Midwest areas. This is something that is especially very closely linked to the Ojibwe, Chippewa, and Anishinaabe tribes. They had been known for harvesting manuman, or otherwise known as wild rice, for quite a while. Their techniques and in-depth knowledge of the process had been a treasured community resource for several centuries. Wild rice was something that would always occur naturally since it was an aquatic grain. It would thrive in slow-moving streams and slightly shallow lakes, of which there were many back then. Cranberries were also a very key component because they were one of the few things indigenous to North America and grew in incredible abundance throughout the northeastern stretch of land. The nutritional benefits of mixing both together meant that they had a rice-based dish with a lot of protein, fiber, and an incredible amount of vitamin C and essential minerals. This is really the kind of thing you'd eat to give your body a shot of everything it needs. Before European contact, a lot of Native American tribes had an incredible amount of access to wild tubers and roots. This was really true for potatoes, which had been domesticated in South America. They began to replace some root vegetables as a staple crop because of the sheer amount of utility. I mean, that's a cultural fact that holds true even now. Who can really deny the worth of a potato? Some days, it feels like it's worth more than all the designers in your wardrobe. Native Americans also had an incredibly interesting way of preparing these potatoes. Frying them in bear fat is definitely something I haven't really thought of before. But then again, these people used to hunt bears semi-regularly, so I think we're on pretty different ends of the spectrum. The potatoes would be sliced and fried in bear fat on a flat stone over an open fire, and it would actually make for some extremely rich and crispy potatoes. Sumac lemonade was something that was known as sumac-ade, but it was actually just a citrus-esque beverage that had an incredible amount of tart to it. It was made from staghorn sumac, which was a plant that produced berries, and smooth sumac. For Native American tribes, these are two instrumental berries due to the way they function as both a nifty food source when fast-acting nutrition is required and a medicinal ingredient. Sumac berries were also something that ripened in the late summer, and they were always steeped deeply in water so that a refreshing, vitamin C-rich drink could be made. Lemons had not been introduced to the North American region yet, so sumac was the next best and closest thing. Still, it had a lot more uses than lemonade ever did. You could use sumac to even flavor different kinds of game and soups, which isn't something you usually hear too much about lemon. Sumac berries were actually harvested when they were deep red, dried, and fresh, and the cold water would help to get the tart flavor out without releasing the tannins that were there inside. The optional sweeteners, such as maple syrup and agave syrup, were really helpful in balancing that tartness out, but most people just had sumac lemonade as it was. They had to be steeped in the water for hours and strained thoroughly though, which was definitely a lot of work. I think this one might actually work better as a cool history fact, instead of a Saturday dinner you're investing in. But hey, trying new things is cool too. There's definitely nothing as new as a roasted prickly pear cactus for dinner, but to us, it's just an out-of-the-box idea. To them, it was a pretty standard dinner. In arid regions like the Southwest, where cactus growth was always something you would expect, both the pads and the fruit were always eaten. However, cactus on its own isn't exactly the most palatable thing, so roasting it would really help with that. They had a whole specific preparation process for the cactus too. The pads would be harvested when they were young and tender, and before that, they also become very full of fiber. This was good back then because it meant they could be full for a lot longer, and a lot of food and meal plans were designed for sustainability rather than just for the thrill of it. Still, removing the glochids, otherwise known as the spines of the cactus, was as painful as you could imagine. They had tricks for making it quicker, but it was a pain. Native Americans would usually burn off the spines over open flames, or they would scrape them off or cut them with knives. They would also boil them sometimes to loosen the spines. It's definitely one recipe that's really out there, right? Also, interestingly enough, the cacti had a lot of medicinal benefits, like an incredible amount of fiber, a lot of vitamin C, and intense hydration. What people would typically do with sunchokes, also known as wild sunflowers or earth apples, would be to mash them, roast them, and dry them. Some of these were done so that they could be preserved and used later on a rainy day, while some were so that they could be used with other kinds of recipes and foods. Sunchokes were cultivated by tribes like the Pawnee, Dakota, Ojibwe, and Iroquois. And unlike potatoes, sunchokes were a staple of the indigenous community a long time before there was anyone else but them roaming the land. They were a big part of how the community got inulin, which was a natural fiber that was really good for digestion. Sunchokes could also be eaten alone and mixed with other kinds of things such as nuts and herbs or corn. Sunchoke mash was something that would be harvested in the fall and winter, and it was one of the few sources of sweetness that people had left to them. The water and broth would be used to make the tubers softer, and the bear fat, or buffalo tallow, was added in to make them overall more rich. The sage, wild garlic, and jumper berries were often the final touch in this dish, giving the mash that herbal aroma it was missing. Wild boar roasts were a pretty common activity for Native Americans, but it wasn't something that they came up with. This was actually something they took from the Europeans for once. It was brought over to America by European explorers active during the 16th century. They brought it over in the Southwest, but native species began to spread over to the Southeast after continuous hunting. Tribes like the Creek and Seminole eventually adapted and began to incorporate boris into their diets as well, using their own traditional methods like roasting and pit cooking. The wild boars were really tough to hunt though, but they got pretty good at hunting them down too because of their experience with bows and spears. Some cool military facts. Now, they wouldn't eat the boars as soon as they got them. These were actually mostly preserved for the winter because of the massive amounts of meat they would give. Cholla buds with agave syrup were a desert superfood that originated all the way from the Southwest. This is actually one of the few kinds of cactuses that are edible. They were known as the cholla cactus, and they were a plant that was native to the Mojave and Sonoran deserts. They were edible flower buds, and other southwestern tribes were known for harvesting and eating these buds for centuries. Among the tribes, the most notable ones were the Pima and Tohono O'odham tribes. The cholla buds were traditionally gathered by both during the start of spring, but they had to be carefully picked with sticks or tongs so that the spines of the cactus could be avoided. Next, they had to be roasted and dried, and they had a few flavors to offer, but it was mostly nutty notes and tangy tastes. That did make them versatile though, especially when they were combined with agave syrup. It was something that was made from the agave plant and was used as a sweetener since way before Europeans ever stepped foot on American soil. This combination of agave syrup and the buds of the cholla cactus created a very earthy dish that had almost everything you needed. It wasn't overly sweet, and the syrup had a pretty low glycemic index, actually. The buds were very high in calcium. They were great for bone health, and one serving of them had more calcium than milk did. So, there's a reason they grew up so strong. If one of these dishes brought back a memory or made you curious to try something new, tell us your favorite in the comments. Give this video a like to honor the traditions, and subscribe so we can keep cooking up history together.